As of August 17th, no buyer will be able to tour a property with a real estate agent without first signing a buyer broker agreement. There are some very huge practice changes coming to the real estate industry, which are going to greatly affect you, the consumer, when you are now buying a property. Also, sellers who are going to be selling their homes in the future, and also sellers who have current active properties that are not yet under contract as this settlement starts to approach. And August 17th is only 14 days away. So I have been in training after training. We've been preparing for this change for like the last 4 months. However, we didn't have new forms or really know what the new rules were going to mean or entail until about 2 days ago. So I have been putting off making a video about this just in order to not put out wrong information and to give people bad guidance because it was constantly changing minute by minute, and nobody was really sure what the practice changes meant or what it was going to quite look like until now that we all have a bit more guidance. If you're a buyer, and I think this is especially important because we are, as an industry, preparing for a bit of an uptick in unrepresented buyers. And I will go over a very red flag warning if you're somebody who lands in that category, what you're giving up, what you're giving away, what you're signing away, what you might not know you're giving up when you don't have anybody representing you. So, first, let's jump into what this means for buyers. So, as a buyer, if you call a real estate agent up and say, "Hey, Nicole, I'm flying into town these days and we want to go look at this, and this property." We now actually have to have an agreement in place, and I cannot show you any of those homes until that agreement is signed. So, previous Utah law, the way that it worked was we've always had buyer representation in the state. We're one of the few states that had it. So it's not a drastic change for us. The biggest change for us is the fact that it has to be signed before you tour any home. So if you're somebody who is maybe just testing out a real estate agent to see if you like them, you're dating before you actually get married, before you sign the documents. In Utah, previous law was there were three documents that had to be signed before an agent could actually represent you and be a fiduciary duty to you and be your agent. And that was a buyer broker agreement, a buyer due diligence checklist, and a wire fraud disclosure. All three of those agreements had to be signed before you wrote an offer on a property. And there are many, many people who never got those documents signed until their buyer, their customer found a property they liked. And then they just filled out the forms for that property. And that's how it's been for a long time. So if you were somebody who's been watching me for a long time, maybe you've been looking for a house for 4 years in Park City, I probably didn't make you sign anything when you first came into town, if it was a very long time ago. However, if you've worked with me in the last year or the last 2 years, I would not show anybody a property unless they actually had that agreement signed before I showed them the property. So I definitely switched up my business practices as I got more confident, just saying, "Hey, I'm not going to show you a bunch of houses and potentially not get paid on these if you decide to go work with another real estate agent and then buy the house that I showed you." So, in a sense, it's a protection for everybody because when you do not have that agreement signed, you as a buyer, nothing's confidential. Nobody represents you. Nobody owes you anything. They don't need to pull comps for you. They don't represent you essentially. You're a customer, you're not a client. In order to become a client, you must sign all those documents. So now if you guys can see that, this is a buyer guide. So this goes through everything that you need to know as a buyer when you're buying a home, right? And what a realtor is going to do to help you get that property. So if you're a buyer who is thinking about buying a house in the future and you want to use me, I cannot show you any homes until I sit down with you and have a consultation with you, go over this entire guide with you, and review the forms with you. And the three forms would be the buyer brokerage agreement, the buyer due diligence checklist, and the wire fraud disclosure. in real estate, there are three documents that govern a real estate transaction. The first agreement, the first document, is the listing agreement. That is between the seller and the seller's agent that they hire. And that is the first document that governs a real estate transaction. Then you have a buyer's agent who has an agreement with their buyer. So there is a buyer's brokerage contract. So you've got an agreement between the buyer and their buyer's agent. The third agreement that is governed, it governs a real estate transaction, is the real estate purchase contract. So this is the actual offer that a buyer writes up and gives to the seller. And this contract is between the seller and the buyer. Okay, so those are the three contracts agreements that govern a real estate transaction. So what does this mean if you are a seller? Well, now when you are a seller for the longest time, you've always offered kind of an incentive for a buyer's agent. So most of the time, buyers were not having to pay for their agents out of their own pocket. It was offset when the listing agent and the seller negotiated in that agreement. They said, "Hey, Mr. Seller, this is my fee. And if somebody else brings a buyer to your property, another agent, another brokerage brings a qualified buyer who can close on the property, I'm going to split X percentage of my commission with that buyer's agent." So as a seller, everyone who currently has an active listing that is not under contract by August 14th will have to add a new addendum to their current listing agreement. And basically, I actually really like this new form. I think it's super transparent. It really is much better. I think it's a wonderful form. It really highlights, hey, Mr. Seller, this is what you're paying the listing brokerage. Now, if an unrepresented buyer comes along now, because now that we're entering into a world where buyers now have to have an agreement signed with a real estate agent before a real estate agent can even show them homes, we might see some buyers say, "Yeah, F that. I'm just going to go straight to the listing agent. I'm just going to call the listing agent." And I don't really want to be represented because I don't want to be on the hook for potentially having to pay my own agent if that seller isn't going to offset the compensation for me. So maybe I'll just try to go at this on my own and be unrepresented. So then there's a section in the listing agreement that says, here's what happens if an unrepresented buyer comes in and they don't want any representation from any side. Here's a fee if there is an unrepresented buyer, right? So here's the list fee. Here's a fee if potentially an unrepresented buyer comes along and the listing agent has to help the unrepresented buyer basically through the paperwork, but they don't owe them anything else. So we'll get to what happens when you're an unrepresented buyer at the end of this. And I think you'll go, wow, I'm giving up all of that. I had no idea. Heck yeah, I want my own representation to help me get through this. And then there's a section for limited agency. In other states, they call it dual agency. That would be when the listing agent represents the seller and the buyer says, "Well, I don't have an agent, but I want you to also represent me." And that agreement cannot be entered into without seller's permission. So there are many sellers who might be like, "Absolutely not. I do not want you also representing the buyer that is buying my home," because essentially that makes that real estate agent neutral and they can't help negotiations on the seller side. They can't help negotiations on the buyer side. They are really just facilitating the transaction to get it to closing and becoming neutral in most of their fiduciary duties. So you can see that most agents don't really like being a limited agent. They don't really like being a dual agent. It's a lot of work. It's really, really difficult. And most people would prefer not to do it. So I think most people would rather have a buyer have their own representation so that they can get through the inspections, the appraisal, the deposits. Um, as a listing agent, you as an unrepresented buyer, that listing agent has no duty to call you to remind you that your earnest money goes hard tomorrow, that your due diligence deadline is up in 10 minutes. No duty to, if you get a home inspection and you come back, to negotiate the home inspection on your behalf. They're not going to do that for you because they don't represent you, they represent the seller. So there are kind of a bunch of red flags, but we're entering into this new sort of world. It's going to be interesting how it works out. Now, you as a seller, you might have been listening to headlines, you might have been listening to the news with saying, you don't have to pay a buyer broker anymore. And you don't have to if you don't want to, but you also can choose to if you want to. So you also have the freedom. There is a section in the listing agreement that says, hey, would you also like to offer compensation to a buyer's broker if they bring a successful buyer along and what that amount is? So basically, in the new listing agreement, it's saying, here's the listing brokerage fee. Now, what happens if we have an unrepresented buyer? Now, what happens if we're dual agency or limited agency here in Utah? And what would you like to offer for a buy side brokerage? And I think the most important thing to understand here is that, and this is more unsettling to real estate agents than it is to consumers because you guys couldn't see the MLS anyway. So you had no idea what the compensation was or what your agent was getting paid. So previously, when I would go to the MLS, there would be a section on the MLS where it said buyer broker commission, right? And so I knew, great, that seller is offering this fee, and my fee is also the same amount as the fee the seller is willing to pay. This is a great match. My buyer's not going to be on the hook for owing any more money. I'm not going to have to take a discount. Things like that, right? So I knew the percentage that I was going to get paid on every listing because there was a section in the MLS for that. Well, that section is now gone. Park City MLS took it off about a week ago. So no listings have any buy side brokerage on it. So what does that mean? Well, in previous years, that meant that that was how you got paid, right? It was never in the REPC. It was kind of like the cooperating compensation and the brokerages, that amount went through the MLSs, and now that's gone. So basically, if you're a buyer and you have a real estate agent representing you, your real estate agent now needs to negotiate that fee into the real estate purchase contract. And we do believe that there will be changes to our real estate purchase contract that will allow for a buyer to ask for compensation in there. However, whatever fee the buyer and the buyer's agent have negotiated, they cannot accept more. So let's say they negotiated a 2.5% buyer brokerage fee. And let's say they end up buying a house, putting an offer in where the seller was actually offering 3%. Well, now that buyer broker's agent can't take 3% because they only agreed to 2.5, unless they come back to you and they say, hey, I'm able to get paid more on this property. The seller is offering more money. They're offering 3%, and you would amend the agreement with the buyer's permission. So there's lots of changes coming. I think the biggest one is that basically, if you are a buyer, you can no longer tour a home without a real estate agent, just by calling them up and saying, hey, I want to go look at this house. And I think most people are a little nervous about that just because people have instant gratification, like they need instant gratification immediately, right? We live in this world of Amazon Prime, of next day delivery, where we get everything we want immediately. And now we have to go pump the brakes. I'm sorry, I actually have to have a 30-minute to an hour consultation with you and explain everything that I'm going to do for you from A to Z, like I would when I go to a listing presentation and I pitch to a seller and I talk about the marketing and the fees and the forms and the what are the terms between us and all the things. Now that's just going to be replicated on a buy side. So people who there's going to be buyers who are not going to want to sign those, and totally understandable because you don't need to buy real estate with a real estate agent. You don't need to sell real estate with a real estate agent. However, there's a reason why this profession exists, and people would rather have a professional handle it for them and get you through the process. So, the one thing that I did want to go over that was incredibly eye opening if you are an unrepresented buyer or you choose to be an unrepresented buyer. Yes, we have form after form after form, training after training after training, 10 new forms here. So an unrepresented buyer, it's just basically if you decide you do not want a buyer's agent to help you and the listing agent can't help you because that seller says, sorry, you're my agent. I don't also want you to be that buyer's agent. You would have to sign this unrepresented buyer disclosure if you chose not to hire your own representation. And it just basically breaks down what a seller agent is, what a buyer's agent is, an agent that represents both buyer and seller. And then the confirmation of agency in the transaction, it's saying the agent that you're talking to, Mr. Unrepresented Buyer, only represents the seller. So, in connection with a transaction between buyer and seller, buyer is acknowledging that the seller's agent and the company has no duty and no obligation to the following. So, they're not going to compile or analyze data for you on the MLS, like comps, to justify or analyze the purchase price of the property. So if you're a buyer and you're like, hey, what should I offer on this property? And you're unrepresented, that seller's agent is going to say the purchase price or more. They cannot negotiate the sales price for you. They cannot negotiate on your behalf as a buyer regarding items found or discovered by you as the buyer during your due diligence. So, home inspection items. So, there's a bunch of home inspection items that come up on your report. They're not negotiating that for you in your favor. Negotiate on the buyer's behalf regarding any other aspect of the transaction, recommending any contract addendums or any other contract terms or any actions that could weaken the position of a seller. They have no obligation to maintain confidentiality. So whatever you tell them, they can turn around and use that against you in negotiation to benefit the seller. With respect to anything communicated or discovered by the buyer. So whatever you discover, um, the listing agent has a duty to tell their seller. Monitor and advise the buyer regarding purchase contract deadlines, including those deadlines that may cause you, as the buyer, your earnest money to become non-refundable. Yeah, you can't get your deposit back because you don't have an agent that's going to call you the night before and say, hey, I just want to remind you your earnest money goes hard today. Do we still have the green light to move through this transaction? You don't have that. You don't have that person reminding you that your earnest money is becoming non-refundable. You also don't have a person reminding you that your due diligence deadline is up, that your financing and appraisal deadline is up, and you don't have somebody helping you getting to the closing table when you're going to sign, when the loan is going to fund and record, when you're going to get your keys, when can you get your keys, all of those things. So these foregoing tasks are examples only and not intended to be a complete list that a seller's agent or company will not perform on a buyer. The only thing that we can do for you as a seller, if we're a seller's agent only and you're an unrepresented buyer, is provide you with the state approved real estate purchase contract, um, fill it out, and give you a buyer due diligence checklist. And that's basically it. And we can't really do anything else for you. So you're on your own basically. The only obligations that we have as real estate agents to a customer is to treat you honestly, fair dealings, and good faith. So that's all you get when you are an unrepresented buyer. So you're giving up a lot, which is pretty crazy, right? The buyer's agent negotiates on your behalf. They tell you what you need to offer. They help you craft a winning offer if you're in a multiple offer situation. Um, you as a limited, like when I think about this going down the line into like a multiple offer situation, and I'm thinking, okay, I represent the seller. I have an unrepresented buyer that comes along who wants me to also be their agent, but then another unrepresented buyer comes along and they also want you to be their agent. You can't do that, right? You cannot do that. So you are putting yourself as a huge disadvantage by not having an agent, right? And I think a lot of buyers don't realize that when they are calling like a new development or they're calling a builder. That builder's agent has no duties or obligations to you as the buyer. They represent the builder and the builder's best interest, and they're basically just filling out the form for you as well. And that's it, right? When you have your own representation, they're there to remind you and they're there to help you get through the transaction. They're there to help you with inspections, appraisals, negotiation, making sure you don't lose your deposits, making sure you don't lose your earnest money. They are there to provide complete confidentiality to anything that you have to say. You've got to be, if you do not have your own representation and you're an unrepresented buyer, everything that you sort of share is not confidential. So keeping that in mind as well. And there's a lot of changes that are coming. We're still figuring it all out. There's going to be a new listing agreement form, obviously a new buyer's agency agreement form. There's unrepresented buyers disclosures. There's addendas for being compliant for people who are under contract currently. Um, and all of this is going to basically, all these practice changes are basically happening August 17th. And I also think that people don't realize, like people who are the Zillow shoppers who say contact agent, what you're going to understand now is that when you press that contact agent button, Zillow is actually going to take you to an agreement first. And you're going to have to sign that agreement before you can go see a home with the agent that they've connected you with. And I'm not on Zillow, I don't pay for leads. I'm on YouTube, and that's where I get all my business from. And so I feel like the people that do call me already know, like, and trust me for the most part because they've been watching me for a long time. So I don't get a lot of cold leads, cold people who don't know me and don't trust me. So I'm lucky in that sense that I've built a lot of trust with you guys who've used me or have called me to help you buy a house or sell a house. I've built the trust online. Um, but for people who definitely do use those services like Zillow, or you go to a home search site and press contact agent, you're not exactly contacting the listing agent. You're contacting the person who is paying the most for leads. Because what Zillow does, um, is they basically sell leads back to agents. So there's people who pay a lot of money to uh, come up first on Zillow so that you actually call them and they show you a home. So big changes are coming down the pipeline. Some scary things if you're thinking about being an unrepresented buyer. Um, as a buyer buying a property, you're really going to have to slow down, select an agent more carefully, interview more people, and you're going to have to pump the brakes. And I know that's hard for people because they don't like paperwork. And real estate is a complex process and it is a very large financial transaction. It's just something that should not be rushed into, and there should be extreme transparency around how things work. And I think just the public needs to be educated a little bit more on what the process actually entails, what we actually do for you. Because before we basically just patted you on the head and said, it's all good, I'll take care of it, don't worry about it. And we never really showed you the villains that arise and that happen, and that when things can go wrong, you don't really ever see that because we're just like, we'll take care of it. We'll fix it. We'll do it. Don't worry about it. And now we actually have to slow down and start with that.